So, how this video came about is I was recently, about a month ago, I was watching one of my favorite YouTubers' Patreon videos, and they were talking about the male gaze versus the female gaze. And by that I mean Gaze, not Gays, which that's what I kept hearing every time she talked about it. Every time she kept saying the female gaze, I was like, yeah, what about me? Yes, I am the female gaze. um, but what's funnier is that what she was actually talking about when she discussed the female gaze was that to her mind, she feels that the female gaze is more like fanfic than it is Magic Mike, because that was like one of the examples that she originally gave. And so one of the things she talked about was, I guess there was a book that came out maybe in the early 2000s, I don't really know, that was kind of detailing the women who write same-sex male erotica for fanfic. And they kind of interviewed a couple thousand people. It's not really a big roster of people, but they interviewed a couple thousand people and got sort of like dynamics of the sort of people who write this sort of thing. That was a really weird sentence. And got the dynamics of people who write this type of fanfic. And the overwhelming majority was, of course, straight women, cishet women, probably. I don't know if they asked whether or not someone was trans. I guess I'd have to look at the video again. But mostly cishet women. And there were a not insignificant amount, I would say maybe 5-6% at the time, of lesbians. And so, of course, she posed the question, why would a lesbian write gay male erotic fanfic? So naturally, as myself, a writer of gay male erotic fanfic, I felt the need, and as a trans lesbian, I felt the need to pop in my own thoughts. Now, naturally, I did respond to this on Patreon directly. I commented and kind of added my 2 cents, but I realized as I was writing that comment, I actually wanted to make a whole video talking about this. And in case you were wondering, this does relate to Good Omens specifically because that is what I am writing gay male erotic fanfic for at the moment. So I feel like this is kind of like a full circle thing for me. So I guess the question that I have to answer first is why? Why does anyone do anything? Fun, boredom, I don't know, take your pick. But I feel like for me, I have sort of an interesting relationship in general with fanfic, right? Because I have been in fanfic spaces for a while now. I think I discovered it when I was 18. I'm one of the rare people in the world who discovered it kind of at the actual adult age to be reading this sort of material, which is kind of funny. And when I discovered it, I can tell you how naive I was to the whole thing, because I remember being a senior in high school. I remember one of my best friends was reading fanfic on her Kindle, and this was back in the fanfic.net days. So if any of you are actually old enough to remember those days, you will remember very well that website. It, as far as I know, it still exists, but most people don't use it, so I don't know how popular it is at this point. But at the time, that was kind of the only place. Archive of Our Own did not exist at this point. Tumblr did, but I don't know what the population was in the fanfic world for Tumblr at the time. But I would imagine it did exist, but I was not... Was I on Tumblr at that point? I think the first account I created was in 2009, but I don't remember a lot of Tumblr in those days. So I don't remember if that was a thing or if I was even part of fandom Tumblr, because I did leave for a little bit and then came back when I got to college because one of my friends was super into Tumblr, and that's where I really started getting into it again. But at the time, I wasn't really into it in that way. I was kind of just trying to find a place to have a blog, actually, ironically, which is not what most people use Tumblr for, especially these days. But at the time, I think even then they didn't use it like that. So my friend was reading this fanfic on her Kindle, and I was like, hey, what's that? And she's like, oh, it's fanfic. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know what that is. And she told me like where to find it and all of that. And I was like, okay. So I decided to look it up and looked up fanfic.net, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I can read like more stories based on this series that I already liked. And this should give you an idea of just how naive little Sissa was, because I actually had to Google the phrase. And I'm laughing at myself in hindsight, because anyone who knows anything about fanfic would know right away the answer to this question, but I did not. So I had to Google, does gay fanfic exist? And yes, it does, in fact. Very much so. It's kind of the main thing about fanfic, as it turns out. But I didn't know that at the time. So I Googled it, and of course I found what I was looking for, and I was hooked, like immediately. And so naturally, I started kind of devouring more and more. I got into different we'll say fandom redacted, as I often do. That was the fandom that I started with fanfic. And I didn't really dabble in writing it for a long, long time. Even though I had been writing original work myself for many, many years at that point, I still didn't really feel comfortable dabbling into writing fanfic. For whatever reason, I just felt like I wouldn't be able to get the characters right, even though a lot of what I'd read was, but it for whatever reason, for me, it didn't make sense. So I just read it, enjoyed it, and at that point in my life, that was before I transitioned. So that was before I even knew these things about myself. So at that point, I did identify as a gay boy, as I have said. And then, I kind of kept reading it throughout my 20s, and even, past my transition. And at that point, I was kind of already still, even though I had transitioned and now I was pretty sure at that time I was straight, I was like, well, I'm just going to keep reading this because I don't know if I really want to, get into. I was kind of invested in this particular pairing at the time, so I was like, I'm not gonna try and find something else that would fit who I am now. I'm just gonna leave it. So I mean, for me, it kind of felt like I was just very invested in the pairing at that point, and I kind of just decided, okay, I'm just gonna stick with this. And as I started finding other fandoms that I was interested in, I just found myself gravitating more towards the male pairings, and so I just kept up with that. And then as time went on, I kind of fell out of it for a little bit when I got into a relationship, and then when that ended, I kind of found my way back into it, and I found it very comforting. And so I just kind of fell back into the same pairing that I had been into before. So I just kind of fell into that habit, and so I never really fell out of it. I think at that point, I think would have been right before I realized that I might be bi. But again, it was kind of one of those things that at this point I was already so committed to reading this fanfic one way and writing it that way, that even when I did realize about myself that I was a lesbian, or even when I realized I was trans, I was kind of like, I'm already committed to this, so I'm kind of just gonna stay in this lane. Eventually, I did stop writing fanfic for a couple of years, and then of course, as actually, what's funny is I stopped writing it, and even though I was into the first season of Good Omens, I really didn't pick back up with the fanfic world until the end of season 2. Because something about the way season 2 ended just started something in my brain that I haven't been able to shut off since. And so I decided to write one story, and one story became, we're now at 300,000 words in the last 4 months. So yeah, you could say it started something. Not one story, mind you, just multiple stories, but about 310,000 words, I think, over the course of the last 4-ish months, which is wild to me, and the most I've written in 4 months in my life. And what's funny is I wrote more in the last 4 months than I had in the preceding 3 years. It's a multi-part answer, right? Partly it's because it was just kind of what I started with, and so it just was familiar, and I just kind of stuck to that. But another part of the reason is because at a certain point, the lesbian yearning becomes so strong that you have to put it somewhere else. And I found for me that writing about gay male characters allowed me a sort of separation. So I could still write about, or read about love and romance and all these things, but there was the separation between the characters and myself enough to where I didn't feel bogged down by yearning, because it's like, I'm not this, so I don't feel like, oh, I wish I had that like this. I still wish I had that kind of experience, but not in the same way, if that makes any kind of sense at all. Yes, it's what I started with, and so that I've just kind of stuck with it. And yes, part of it is just because there is that separation. But I think there is something to be said, about being a, femme lesbian who is into butches, and that not really existing in a lot of media, especially, certainly not in television media or film media, but it really doesn't even exist in fanfic necessarily. It does occasionally, but usually as a background thing, and even then, like, not that frequently. So, you're kind of left with a situation where more often than not, gay male erotica is kind of what there is. That is kind of the main driver of most fanfic, and that's kind of the most devoured of fanfic, and that's its own discussion as far as I'm concerned. But it kind of put me in a position where, when you don't see that representation, yeah, I could write it, and I have. It's like, it's a multifaceted thing, right? I think there's a lot of different reasons that anyone writes anything when it comes to, not even just fanfic, just any type of writing. I'm someone who's been writing for the last 20 years, and part of the reason that I have done more fanfic lately is because I have more of a viewership or readership, and that's something that's very exciting to me. I went from having nobody read my work to having, on this most recent round in the last 4 months, I've had over 100,000 people reading things that I've written, yes. Reading things that I myself wrote, regardless of whether or not I own the characters or anything else. They are my words, and that's very, very exciting. And prior to that, my whole 2 years of writing for Fandom Redacted, I gained 500,000 readers in that 2 years, which was astounding to me and meant so, so very much. And so in a way, that keeps me going, because it's inspiring to have people like what you're writing, and to have people enjoy what you're writing and enjoy what you're putting out there. That's reassuring and refreshing, and so that keeps me going. With my own original fiction, I do tend to lean towards more butch femme characters, because I want that inclusion. I want this type of story to exist in the world, but at the same time, it is kind of a push-pull, because I do feel like what people maybe want to read more of, I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think stories about queer male characters do better in, most media. And I'm not going to say that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not going to get into a argument about that. I think that's kind of petty. And quite frankly, I think it's not altogether helpful to get into such an argument. And I don't want to do a whole, queer men versus queer women fight. I don't think that's at all helpful to our community. I'm not going to get into my own personal wants and desires in this video. That is not the point of this video, and I don't think YouTube would appreciate that, nor would any of my family who may be watching this channel currently. What was my point in all of that? I think for a lot of straight women, it's kind of like the idealized idea of a man. Not always. Obviously, there's a lot of toxic men that girls have written about in fanfic. We've all seen the stories. I believe one of my favorite YouTubers, Strange Eons, just did a video about the phenomenon of, being sold to One Direction. So we know there are some toxic tropes in fanfic. We certainly know there are some toxic ideas that are thrown around and are very popular. So I don't think it's necessarily the idea of like the idealized man that I think is kind of the common trope. But I'd be lying if I said that I didn't see myself in one character over another, and I did not sort of write a version of myself in that character. But I think everyone does that. You can say you don't, but most writers do that in most things that they write, original or not. So I would be lying if I said when I'm writing, any kind of original novel that features two lesbian characters, that I am not putting myself, or at least a version of myself, into one of them a little bit more than the other, and putting what I like or what I'm attracted to in the other character. So I think that's just kind of a thing that happens in writing. I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm not going to take any criticism on it at this time, but it's just something that happens. And so yeah, I would be lying if I said there was not a little bit of myself in the way I write. I'm not going to specify. I will leave you to guess. And I feel like you're never going to, because the way I dress and carry myself on this channel might imply one thing, but I'm going to be honest. It's probably not what you're thinking. Or maybe it is. I don't know. By the way, I'm just going to say this because it's funny. Originally, my mother was like, oh, why don't you link your fanfic to your YouTube channel? And I was like, I don't know about that. There's no real reason why I don't. I don't know. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't know why, but I've just always had this thing where I feel like I need to keep a separation. So yeah, I'm not going to be linking my own fanfic in this video. I did also have an idea of talking about like common tropes in fanfic and ranking, and kind of like talking about some of my favorites and why they're my favorites, and what's interesting about them, at least in the fanfic I read. That's kind of different from necessarily fanfic that exists, because here's the thing, right? There's lots of different tropes that exist in the internet, like I was saying, sold to One Direction, that I don't participate in, and I don't see, and I have no viewpoint on. So I can't possibly talk about every single trope or every single type of fanfic that exists, but I'd be very interested in talking about just some of my favorites and maybe why they're my favorites. And I don't know if I would go into specific examples, but maybe. But if you guys would want to see that, I will happily talk about that. I mean, really nothing's off limits at this point. Some things I feel like are harder to talk about than others, let's say. But yeah, I don't know. This video is not quite what I imagined it was going to be. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to comment down below, tell me your thoughts. If you read or write fanfic and happen to be a lesbian yourself, I would love to hear your thoughts as to why, what brought you to this. More just for my own curiosity. I'm not going to report back, but I would love to know, because I I know my own reasons for doing so, but I'd love to know anyone else's reasons for doing so. Subscribe to my channel. Of course, you can also become a member of my channel. I'm very excited about memberships. We have 2 tiers. We have the Ineffable tier and we have the R-side tier. The R-side tier does get a little bit more. On the Ineffable tier, I do believe you get like little emotes and chat things. You get kind of special privileges with chats, and then with the R-side tier you do get early access, and you do get like special shout outs on the channel and things like that. So it's very, very exciting. I would love to have you guys become a member of my channel. You can also become a member of my Patreon. That's patreon.com/NarcissDeville. That's my members only behind the scenes channel. I would love to do more specific videos just for that. I mean, if you guys want to see videos talking about fanfic stuff specifically on that, we can do that. Or I can do that, I should say. So just let me know what you guys think. And yeah, until next time, stay devilish and see you next Tuesday.